So good afternoon. You all should know me, but for those of you that don't, I'm James Peck, the Curator of Collections here, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I think this is going to go, and there's always room for change, right? So first what I want to do is I want to read you about a one-page introduction, and then I'll get into the slides, and I hope that afterwards there'll be a little bit of time for a discussion or questions if you have any. And that's it, other than I plan on taking about an hour, so I hope you are all anticipating, get nice and comfy in there. And I'm trying to do a brief history of American West art from about 1820 to 1950. So it's a really broad swath, and this is really just an introduction. This is condensed from 2 semesters in college that I did that were the history of Western art. Getting it down to 1 hour was kind of a challenge from a year of classes. But I'm going to give it my best, and I will try to project. I'm sorry, I know some of you, need that, so I will try my best to do my school professor projection. So good afternoon. Thank you all for having me here, and I know it's amazing that I'm actually here, right? So the first thing I want to do is give you my working definition of the West. The West historically has been 3 things in one: a place, a process, and an attitude. As a geographic place, it has been something of a moving target. In colonial times, the Ohio Valley was the West. Later, the Mississippi River. Finally, by the mid-19th century, California, Oregon, and Washington were understood to be the West. In time, the West as a place came to include vast deserts, sublime mountain ranges, ancient forests, vast rivers, baked plains, and geological wonders. Yet the West, too, has long been understood as a process. As the frontier moved inexorably toward the Pacific Ocean, the movement of Americans westward became known as manifest destiny. The promise of free or cheap land kept a nation of would-be yeoman farmers moving ever westward in search of gold, crops, and a new life. Unfortunately, the process of Americans conquering and civilizing the continent from sea to sea set this country on a collision course with a wide selection of Indian tribes. As we know, most Indians didn't make out too well in that exchange. The West, too, is most definitely an attitude: masculine, anti-intellectual, unsullied, individualistic, industrious, courageous, and free. The West offers a place to escape from civilization, a place to blend cultures. It is a human and environmental battlefield. It is home of such American archetypes as the Native American warrior and the cowboy, and such iconic scenes as the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, and Yosemite. Western art then reflects these patterns of the West. Western art, for the most part, is representational in style and concerned with accuracy. Why is it so concerned with accuracy? Because early on it was very concerned with scientific endeavors, and we'll hear about that in a minute, and especially in the time before photography. Later, it remained concerned with accuracy because of the needs of Harper's and the illustrated magazines. And the Western illustrations offered some real pluses over photography, even after photography became ascendant. Western art also deals in powerful icons: mountains, cowboys, Taos, the Grand Canyon, and it tracks closely with Western history. Western art wasn't made in a vacuum, however. Europeans, Native Americans, Hispanics, and various other movements, the isms that we all know from art history, etc., changed and challenged Western art throughout time. Western art, though, documented the West, its land, and its peoples. It reported back to the East for the benefit of government and immigrants. It provided a visual record of a land that was, by the mid-19th century, still mysterious and compelling. It helped individuals, corporations, and governments use the West for guidance and expansion. So art really enabled expansion because that was the image that people got of the West. Western nature served as a powerful symbol of patriotism, manifest destiny, and for some, God. And Western nature also showed wonder and awe, but it also a desire to develop the wilderness. So as soon as people quote conquered the West, then the next thing they did was set up a town and try to make it like the East in a sense. So first encounters: science, exploration, and the American Indian. In 1803, America makes a purchase of 800,000 square miles known as Louisiana Purchase from France. And this is definitely the most important purchase of land in American history, and it really sets the West up because most of what was Louisiana Purchase is what we now know as the West. In 1804, President Jefferson had Lewis and Clark document the West. They were to document the topography, the geology, and the ecology of the lands between the Mississippi and the Pacific Ocean. They did this for a couple of reasons. To locate and document an inland water route for trade across the continent, the coveted China route, and they also did it to develop a body of knowledge about resources and people of the West. It's important to remember that around 1800, the West was like going to the moon for most Americans at the time. They had very little, if any, knowledge of anything West. There were trappers on the West Coast from Britain and Russia, but there were very few other people. There were French trappers that came down from Montreal and did that route. And of course, the Spanish had come in the 16th century and gone into what is now New Mexico and Arizona. But most average East Coast dwellers in America had zero idea about what the West looked like. Lewis and Clark expedition was commissioned by President Jefferson, but it did not bring any artists with them. Lewis and Clark did some drawings, but they were not very good. And ever since that mistake of not bringing an illustrator, every westward expedition after that brought one or multiple artists along. So just to refresh you, the camera was developed in 1839, but wasn't widely used until the 1850s and 1860s. So really in 1800, we're talking about drawing and painting. So the first image we're going to see is Samuel Seymour, view at the base of the Rockies from 1820. And this was part of the Stephen Long expedition of 1819 to 1820, which went up the Missouri River to the Platte River. And for Seymour and for his group, this was virgin land. And this particular image has been read as both a wonderment with the West, but also frustration at blockage. So if you look at this image and you see you're not given a clear route through the image, right? So in the picturesque tradition of England in the 18th century, the idea was to give, if you look at most landscapes that are from the 19th century, 18th and 19th century, there's a path to guide you through, right? Your eyes, you can visually take the trip along with the artist, right? Here, we're not really given a way to get through. If you go straight toward the rocks, there's blockage, you can go around, but it's sort of emblematic of the problems of traveling in the West. This is literally territory that they had no idea what they're going to encounter. So they might see a mountain in the distance and say, oh, we can get to that by today, and then 3 days later they're still walking towards it. So there are a lot of problems. Beyond the early expeditions, though, there has been a fascination with Native American tribes here since the very beginning, since the 1600s. And you'll have to forgive me, Native American is a sort of a generic term. If I do know the tribe of a particular Indian, I will say it. But here we have Charles Bird King is the artist, and this is Wanata the Charger, the Grand Chief of the Sioux from about 1826. King paints Western chiefs that traveled east to meet the president. So it's important to remember at this time, the chiefs understood that there was a new power in town, right? So today, there are over 800 tribes in the Americas, right? Speaking thousands of languages, and at the time, it was probably even more diverse, right? Even having said that, though, the Indians understood that the president in D.C. was a powerful person that they had to go pay homage to, like a great chief. And so the Western chiefs would come to the east, they would come to Philadelphia and Washington to meet the president and negotiate treaties. There was a large commission from Thomas McKenney, who was the supervisor of Indian affairs, to Charles King, and he painted hundreds of these images. However, most of them were lost. The Smithsonian, that we all know and love, suffered a great number of fires in the 19th century, and so many paintings were lost. Most of these are known through color lithographs. This happens to be an original oil. Wanata is a fierce man. I think we can see that here. He looks forward at the viewer with nothing but aggression, I would say. He fought for the British against the Americans in 1812. And you see both tradition and acculturation here. He's wearing traditional garbs with the bear-tooth necklace, but also you see the gun very prominently displayed with the feathers, right? So there's acculturation and tradition going on here. He's very proud. He doesn't look like he's a peaceful warrior at all. There's the bear claws, which obviously are for bravery, buffalo skin robe, and the 12 feathers on the gun, or no, the 12 feathers in his hair represent 12 scalps that he collected in the War of 1812. So this guy's pretty fierce, right? He's not playing around. So this is sort of our beginning fascination with the Native American tribes, and it will go on from here. You'll know this painting, I hope. This is George Catlin. This is one of our own pieces, Mandan Indians from the 1830s. Catlin was sort of despairing of all these Western Indians that would come east, and he saw a lot of acculturation. He saw a lot of American and European ways slipping into the way that these Indians would come. Because remember, if you're coming from North Dakota to Washington, D.C. on foot, by the time you get there and back, it's been several years, and so you've picked up a lot of things from Western culture. He said, no, that's not a real Indian, and that's not the first time not the last time we'll hear about real Indians. Those aren't real Indians. What I want to do is I want to travel west and meet wild Indians and paint wild Indians. So he's disillusioned with the non-authentic Indians that he saw. So in the 1830s, he went west to find these real Indians. In 6 years, he made 450 paintings at least. What he did was he would quickly outline the scene in the field and fill them in later in the studio. He would often make copies, which is why sometimes there are multiple Catlins that look very similar, because he made multiple copies. He's not as interested in ethnographic detail. You can see he gets a lot of it here, but he's not interested in being absolutely accurate all the time. It's more about getting the visual idea. And he continues to paint images from the West for years from memory. Catlin took a lot of notes, published books, but his journey to the West also coincided with Indian removal. And it coincided with the trail, like I said, the Trail of Tears, rebellion, disease. And so what Catlin ends up doing, he becomes one of the very first artists to do what I call salvage work. And what I mean by salvage work is this idea that it's the job of Euro-American artists and authors to go in and salvage Indian culture. They see that Indians are dying, Indian ways of life are dying, and they go in and say, let us save it by making pictures and writing notes. The irony, of course, is that these artists and writers don't realize that they're part of the problem, right? That if that their government is causing a lot of these same problems that they're then documenting. The second part of that problem is that it doesn't allow the artist to acknowledge what is going on right in front of their eyes. They become enamored with the past. They become enamored with an Indian that used to exist, right? So here we have George Catlin, Mandan Indians. Even by the 1830s, out west, there would have been some acculturation. There would have been some metal instruments they would have gotten from traders. There would have been some indication that America and Canada and Britain existed, right? But he clears all that out of the way because he really wants an image of the Indian that he has in his mind as being pure or real. And that's the problem with trying to get an image of a real Indian, is that a real Indian is the Indian that's standing right in front of you. That's a real Indian, right? But if you're going for an ideal, you're bound to romanticize. So late in his life, Catlin was in tremendous debt. He took his show on the road to Europe, and he died broke, a very sad man, sort of ironically. Alfred Jacob Miller is sort of the next of the four big early artists before 1850. Miller was born in Baltimore, trained in the U.S. and in Europe, and his images really document the transformation of native cultures. He's influenced greatly by European Romanticism, and his palette is decidedly romantic. And what I mean by that is that it's sort of a anti-intellectual. It's this reaction against mechanism and the machines that influenced the Industrial Revolution. So in England, you get this idea of Romanticism as being anti-intellectual, anti-big machines, anti-mills and things like that. So there was this idea that working in a factory was dehumanizing, and so the way to get away from that was to go back into nature and to create things that were beautiful. So that, when I say romantic, that's with the big R, that's what I mean here. His palette was decidedly romantic and in coloration, meaning it was very high-keyed and very colorful, and the lands were always Edenic. Miller was hired by Sir William Drummond Stewart of Scotland, who was a Scottish lord, to go west. They, that is, Drummond and Miller crossed the plains to western Wyoming, and they reached the Great Plains for what would be the last great rendezvous. And for those of you that don't know, the rendezvous was a huge meeting at the Green River in Wyoming where Indian tribes from all over the West would meet French trappers and others, and they would exchange pelts and other animal goods for Western goods. So this was like the very center of acculturation, right? It was where things from France, Britain, and America that were manufactured would go out into the Indian world, and it was where pelts, which were very valuable, would come back east and go back to Europe. So it was a time when you had thousands of Indians from hundreds of different tribes all in one area, and they were camping out for about a 2-week party. And it was often quite fun. There was often drinking and gambling and lots of fun. So it was a very fun thing to do. But it also gave an artist a huge palette to draw from, right? You all know this one from the galleries. This is Alfred Jacob Miller, Crow Indian on horseback from 1844. This is painted a few years after he gets back, but he took voluminous sketches, right? So going out west was considered getting your source material, and he would come back and he painted for the next 30, 40 years in Baltimore. Interestingly, to patrons in Baltimore that really appreciated the West because they had a lot of timber interests, they had a lot of other interests, railroad interests, things that were pushing out west. And so in the 50s and 60s, when Miller is back in Baltimore, he's painting these paintings for these patrons that have huge interest in the expansion of the West. They like these images. And what do these images show? So this image shows a native woman who is very much in tune with her horse, right? She is beautiful, she's very capable on the horse, but she's also, there's an equivalency between the animal and the person. She is not threatening. She has a bow and arrow, but the look in her face is wistful and otherworldly. So this is not someone who you need to be afraid of. This is someone to have a reverie about, to sort of enjoy for their native beauty, but there's no real threat there.
Okay.
Yes?
Just a question. How do you, this has always been the big debate, is it a man or woman? So did you read something that said it was a woman, or why do you conclude it's a woman?
I think I can't give you the citation right now. I think I did read it was a woman in another source. Okay. They could be wrong too, but I think I've always assumed it was a woman. He painted a lot of women. And so if it were another artist, I would be more cautious about saying woman, because, you know, Remington, well, he painted a few women, not many, you know. So there are certain artists that don't paint a lot of women, but he painted a lot. It's just always, I've always seen it as a woman, so not definitive, more to come. So the Indian here is a natural woman or man. See? Able on a horse, fertile, romantic. Like I said, Miller's patrons in Baltimore liked these type of images because they are peaceful. They talked about the peace and plenty of the West because many of them held Western interests. And Miller's Scottish patron, ironically, really enjoyed these pieces as well because they spoke to his aspirations as a Scottish Highlander to get out from the yoke of British rule. So he really liked the Scottish nobleman who hired him, really liked the idea of, oh, the West, because you can be free, right? Two more, Karl Bodmer and John James Audubon. Bodmer he worked for a German prince, Maximilian, and Maximilian wanted to classify Native Americans. So both Bodmer and Audubon are interested in classification. And so what Bodmer does for Prince Maximilian is they travel roughly the same path that Miller did, not exactly the same. In 1832, Maximilian and Bodmer go 2,000 miles up the Missouri River to Fort McKenzie, Wyoming, and they tame wild Indians by classifying them. Although I chose an image here that wasn't so much about classification, it was more about the thrill of the hunt. And it just shows you the plenty that buffaloes were so plentiful in the 1820s and 30s this is probably not made up. There probably were hundreds, if not thousands of them around everywhere, and we'll see that changes very quickly. In Bodmer's sketches, he was very spontaneous. The etching, as you see here, is a little more ponderous, a little more deliberate. But there is a focus on material culture, where I said with Alfred Jacob Miller, there's not a focus on material culture. Bodmer really focuses on Native American material culture. He studies them in a very scientific manner. And the writings support this, both of Maximilian and Bodmer, of trying to classify, say, what tribe everybody's from and where their origin is. And the emphasis is not on portraiture, but on scientific study and classification. The last of the early artists is John James Audubon. He represents another effort to classify, but this time the flora and fauna of Native America before too much Western expansion. And so what was it that made America unique? In large part, what made it different from Europe was its flora and fauna. There were animals aplenty that didn't exist in Europe. There were plants aplenty that didn't exist in Europe. And so one of the sources of pride in America that we could say back to our European brethren who had 2,000 years of civilization on their side, we could say, aha, but we have these plants and animals that you don't have. So he's a naturalist, not an ethnographer, i.e. he's more interested in studying animals than people. From 1820 to 26, he tries to go into the wild and get as many species of birds as possible. So this is the Birds of America, the huge multi-volume issue that he published. And he had to, ironically, kill a lot of the birds to get these images. He killed thousands of birds to get these images. And so it's always struck me as somewhat ironic that these images seem so lifelike, and yet they're all dead, right? He's shot all of them, and he's had to, early taxidermy them and stuff them back up, and and sometimes the gun would ruin a specimen, so he'd have to shoot another one. He's like, dang it, another one, and he'd have to shoot another one, right? So he'd spend hours and days in the field shooting these poor birds just to stuff them back up and make them look lifelike, right? He made oils of everything, and then they became lithos. Made over 250 paintings. So if that's 250 paintings of birds, he probably had to kill 5 per painting, right? It's like 1,000 birds. Or I don't do math well, so I'm in the arts, but it's a lot of birds. So this is the wild turkey. The painting is on the left. The litho is on the right. And the wild turkey was the national bird before the eagle. Turkeys were very rare in Europe and very hard to get, and they were very plentiful here. A big bird that provided a lot of meat, so it was a very good thing. It was a symbol of U.S. plenty and difference. And so it's what made the United States unique was discovering this flora and fauna. It was both a bird and a national symbol, which gave it another symbol of uniqueness. Subscribers to his color lithograph series, the Double Elephant Portfolio, the birds were life-size. That's what a lot of people don't realize. So this lithograph, I don't know what the scale is here, but would have been life-size, was the size of the bird. These were massive volumes that would have cost the equivalent of like $70,000 in today's money for contemporary people to buy, and yet he couldn't make enough. They were incredibly popular. This is time before the internet, before any popular entertainment, right? And so this was very, very interesting. If you had money and you had a library, you wanted to be on this list to get these lithographs. So if the first part of the 19th century, say 1800 to 1850, was about exploration and an honest, naive attempt to understand what was out there, the second part of the 19th century is really defined by the course of empire. Westward expansion along the Oregon Trail and other routes led to such things as the War with Mexico, 1846 to 48, which gave us New Mexico, Arizona, parts of California, and other areas. It also led to the California 49ers, the gold seekers that went out west. The Mormons tried to escape America by moving to Utah. Then we beat the Mexicans, and they're like, dang it, we're back in America. Really, they did. They were trying to get out of America, and then Utah became America. And this all has to do with the concept of overcrowding. Europe in 1500 had about 10 million people. America around 1500, around the same time, had also 10 million people, but 10 times the land. 10 times. So it was a vast area, right? European immigrants arrive in the East, and so there's always new immigrants arriving in the East, and there's always pressure to use the West as an escape valve, right? So coming from a feudal system where for 2,000 years there's no chance, if your family is born into feudalism, you can't ever buy or have land. You don't ever have that promise. And to come to America, and you can have land free or cheap, right? As long as you're willing to go out, improve the land, cut down the timber, and plant your stock, you can have free or cheap land. And that is the dream of American expansionism, right? Never mind that there were people here first. We have free land, right? And that's really what the driving force behind the westering of America. Overland travel was expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. What is the solution? Railroads. How do we make railroads? Well, we first of all have to figure out what kind of railroads are needed, where they're needed, and that depends on surveys. So in the 1850s and 60s, there are 4 major railroad surveys. The Pope survey, which went through the Southwest, Whipple, which went Arkansas to California, through Oklahoma and New Mexico, Gunnison, which started in St. Louis, went to California, and obviously through Colorado, and the Dodge expedition, which started in Iowa and went through Utah. Many artists, such as John Stanley and others, got their big chance on the surveys. There wasn't a lot of work for artists in the East. Unlike Europe, there wasn't a huge tradition of portraiture, and there just wasn't a lot for artists to do. So a lot of them signed up at their first opportunity to go with one of these expeditions. Sometimes these expeditions would hire multiple artists, and they were gone for years, and there was money to be made and fame to be made, because of course the West was the source material. It's where you drew your inspiration from, and then you went back to your East Coast studio, you finished it off, and you sold it to your East Coast patrons because they had an interest in that, while they didn't have an interest in some other things. The surveys documented possible routes for the railroad, inventoried resources, and also inventoried Indians and kind of their depleted status in the 1850s and 60s. Each survey prints and publishes tremendously. The impact of government publications cannot be overstated. There are 26 million images made. 26 million images made of the West between the 1850s and 1860s for these 4 major expeditions over 20 years. Well, there was actually, there are 18 surveys. I'm talking about the 4 major surveys, but there are a total of 18 surveys. 26 million images in multiple printings. The government released a lot of these images of the West, and this is how the West became known to the East Coast, was through government images largely. Very few people could afford a 10-foot long Albert Bierstadt to teach them about the West. What they could afford was a small lithograph, right, that came in a book. The government, it's hard to overstate how important this was. Imagine this in today's terms. 25 to 33% of government budgets in those 20 years span were dedicated on creating and disseminating reports of the West. Up to 33% of the annual budget was spent on disseminating images and text about Western expansion. Put that in today's terms, that would be hundreds of billions of dollars spent just so that people could know the West. That's how important the West was. And the reports and publications guided lots of overland pilgrims. Empire. So a lot of people don't like to think of America as an empire, but it was becoming one. Along with the movement west, there was inevitable feelings of empire that emerged in Americans. Empire was seen as the natural, normal finding of boundaries. Empire takes its way. As we can see in this image here by Leutze, empire doesn't ask anyone, it doesn't ask permission, it takes. It just goes and it fills out the natural boundaries. So journalist John O'Sullivan in 1839 coined the term manifest destiny, which could be summed up as the obligation or duty of Euro-Americans to settle this continent from sea to sea. Again, those Indians get in the way, but Western art really starts to take on a couple of different functions here. In the 1850s and 60s, a real transitional period, because by 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad connects. So America will connect in 1869, but this time we're still apart. This is 1848. This is War News from Mexico by Richard Caton Woodville, which incidentally there's a fantastic show of his art in the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. Strongly suggested if you can get down there. Art reflects the news of the day too. So You have to remember that lithographs were widely disseminated by this point, by 1848, and the telegraph was in service. So the War of 1848 was the first war that was literally transmitted almost instantaneously from the fronts in Mexico back to Washington, D.C., and also to newsrooms along the west and the east. And so here what we see is the man in the front has the newspaper of the day, and he's amazed, right? And everyone's gathered around to hear him. Think of this as like an early form of the internet, right? They're in a chat room, and they're trying to hear what's going on in Mexico. How are our boys doing? What's the war going on? This was a war that wasn't terribly popular, and so there was a lot of interest in it, those that were for it and against it. And we see here there are different classes of people. There are the older gentlemen, and they're the ones explaining it to the other who can't hear too well. There are the younger gentlemen in the back, and you see some excluded classes. You see the African Americans here that are excluded from the conversation, and you see the older woman in the top that's sort of excluded from the conversation. These are constituents that couldn't vote, right? So they had no real say in it. But what's really interesting here is at the far left, you see the young man who has a cigarette in one hand, and he has a match poised over a powder keg. I don't think I need to explain the symbolism, right? There was a lot of angst about the war of 1846 to 48 with Mexico. And why was that? Because the people we were conquering were brown, not white. And that gave a lot of angst, right? How do we assimilate? There was fear that the troops they did actually go all the way down to Mexico City, that they might conquer Mexico City, and that all of Mexico might become American, and then what do we do with all these brown people and all these Indians? And Indians in this country weren't even citizens yet, and then there were going to be all these other people that weren't like us, and that was very, very concerning. It was also considered folly because it was very expensive and unsure outcome and things like that. So the main point of this illustration, though, is that art through lithographs, which could be disseminated, and this was made into lithographs and disseminated widely, and through the telegraph, news could spread much, much, much more quickly. Troops still took forever to get from place to place, and people still took a long time, but information was traveling at light speed. Another big phenomenon in the middle of the century was the 49ers. And here we have Charles Christian Nall, miners in the Sierra, 1851 to 52. And from 1848 to 49, thousands and thousands of people went to California to mine gold. And there were all these stories that came back, said, it's free, it's cheap, it's easy, anyone can do it, everyone come on. Some people made a fortune, most people did not, but it created this mass exodus to California. And once they got to California and realized there was no more gold or they couldn't make their fortune, a lot of them stayed because, let's face it, it was a long trip. Incidentally, most people made the trip by going down to New Orleans, taking a boat to the Isthmus of Panama, trekking overland across Panama before the Panama Canal, and taking a boat up to California. Honest, it was easier to do that than to take the overland route, which could take 4 or 5 months and was very, very dangerous. So we see here the man in the red shirt, the two men in the red shirt kind of bring your focus to where the action is. And unlike earlier images of the 49ers, which were solitary men panning for gold, here we see cooperation. We see man-made tools. We see the beginnings of civilization in this wild country. So that's one of the many phenomena that brought people west, one of the many reasons. Some artists went west and did images that weren't so specifically about either the 49ers or war, but were more generally about the progress of our country westwards. This is John Stanley. This is seen on the Columbia River from 1852. Early in the 1840s, he went to Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma, with government officials to negotiate with native tribes. Later, he established a portrait studio in Oklahoma. He joined the Mexican War effort in 1846, then traveled up all the way to the northwest in Washington State. And in 1852, he completed an Indian cabinet, which is what Catlin was trying to do. So this idea that you could create enough images of Native Americans that you could travel a show of it, and that would create interest and give you money. Unfortunately, it was destroyed in the same 1865 Smithsonian fire. So he lost most of his work there and had to start over. This is one of the very few landscapes that remains. This is the Columbia River. Many rivers, especially the Columbia, were vital to Western travel. It's 1,200 miles long is the Columbia, starts in Canada, and it's how the Lewis and Clark got to the Pacific on part of the Columbia River. As you can see here, framed on the left and on the right are trees, and this is a European concept, right? This is an idea of how you frame an image, and that where we're supposed to look is between the two trees. This is a trope, right? And going back to my earlier comment about being able to get through the picture, now there's no blockage, there's no frustration, right? You could see a way to get through this, then you could go on the water and you could join the Indians out on the boat, and then you could make your way back to the mountains in the background. So where there had been blockage and frustration, now there's an open area. The West is opening up. It's a scene of commerce too. And this scene of commerce suggests that there's cooperation between Indians and whites, and that there's no danger. But this is falsely idyllic, because there was a lot of danger, especially for Indians, from whites. But there was also danger for whites from Indians, because obviously they were going through strange lands and didn't know the languages, didn't know the people, and quite often things would happen. So the Indians here are set in the past. They're seen as idyllic, yet unprepared for the future, and no threat to U.S. interest. It was important to a lot of Western artists to present Indians in this way as no threat. Here's one of our own paintings, which has been on tour for quite a while. This is the smoke signal. After most of his paintings were burned in 1865 fire, he insured them through making chromolithographs. This was a new technology that allowed artists to make color lithographs. And this was a way that we now know pretty much everything that John McStanley did. It's mostly from lithographs. But this is, one of the rare instances of a genre painting, or a painting of an everyday scene. And what we see here are the last members of a noble but doomed race, the result of white interference in their own folly, in John McStanley's words. So they're making a smoke signal at a time when the telegraph is on the rise, right? And everyone's using telegraph. So he's trying to show how kind of outmoded and outdated they are. Photography has a huge role to play in the West too. So remember I said 1839 is a daguerreotype, but really 1830s and 40s, even into 1850s, photography was very difficult, very time-consuming, very expensive, and the images just weren't all that satisfactory. Imagine when you have someone like Albert Bierstadt painting these big, beautiful scenes. You have John McStanley, all these other people that are painting these beautiful scenes. Then now they can make color lithographs and they can be distributed cheaply. Why would you take a photo, which a daguerreotype was typically, 3 or 4 inches square, and it was very hard to see, it wasn't in color. So there wasn't a lot of popularity for photography yet. By 1869, when this photo is taken by Russell, the Golden Spike Ceremony in 1869, there is a tremendous upsurge in the use of photography. Photography's gotten bigger, cheaper, and it's gotten a lot better, as you can see. And what's really interesting about this is the actual ceremony where the last spike was driven into the ground. And I have the information here. It was, it was ceremonial but still significant. Now you could cross the continent in days, not months. I mean, think about that, right? And so what this does is it opens up the West to a whole new type of person. It opens it up to you and I, to just folks, right? Before this, to get across the West, you had to either be a little bit crazy or you had to be really good with a gun and a horse and a lot of other things. And if you weren't, your odds were iffy, right? They were iffy even if you had those skills. Now, ordinary folks can go west, and that opens up tourism, among other things. The railroad attracted huge amounts of investors and showed the benefit of the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act in 1866 basically set out that if you were an able-bodied person, able-bodied man I should say, and you could go out and clear land, you could basically have it for free, up to 160 acres at the time. It was later changed and reduced. So this is the promise of free or cheap land. And so the railroads, after 20 years of surveying, after hundreds of millions of dollars in today's terms, probably spent on these expeditions, after all this money spent on images, the railroad finally crosses the country in 1869. The Civil War, in fact, had trained an entire generation of photographers. So really the first use of photojournalism was in the Civil War, and you had 20 or 30 photographers. That's all they did full time, was they took pictures of the Civil War. And then when this happens, when the West opens up, they all go out there and they take pictures. What's really interesting about this image is not what is seen, it's what's not seen. And what you don't see is the Irish and Chinese immigrants that built the railroad, right? There were thousands and thousands of immigrants that built these railroads, especially Chinese, and thousands of them that died in the process, and that is not shown. What is shown is the investors and the two railroads coming together. It's very symbolic, very significant. Photography becomes a major industry because photography equals truth to early Americans, right? They don't understand that it can be manipulated, as in who's in and who's out. And photos document the movement of the West to California, to the 49ers, and more. This is a famous image by the Gast brothers, Westward Ho, 1872. The wildlife and Indians have to get out of the way. As you can see here, we have the yeoman farmer coming forward. I love that Providence is actually stringing along the telegraph wire, right? So I think that's quite brilliant. And the Indians are on the left there, as you can see them. They're in the dark. They're literally in the dark. And they are fearful of this progress. There's a railroad coming toward them, 3 different railroads. There you can see the boats from Europe, and everything's pushing them. This is a perfect piece of propaganda, right? Civilization is coming. I'm sorry, it's the goddess Columbia, not Providence. So this really gives us a chance to talk about Albert Bierstadt. Albert Bierstadt comes to his full power right at this time, right in the 1850s and 1860s. He's at his full height. He's born in Germany, moves to the U.S. as a child, but studies art in Germany. He's known for his tight compositions and his dark coloring and his depth and richness in his images. And he originates from the Hudson School tradition. And one of the things that was important about the Hudson River was the Hudson River artists that originated in around this area of New York, actually, in the Hudson Valley, actually, a little bit east of here, they really believed that the landscape was a symbol of progress for this nation, right? The thing that we could be proud of in this nation versus Europe was our land. Its vastness, its mountains, its resources, things like that. So the character of the nation was the character of the land. It showed the ambition of the nation. It showed how we were different and better than Europe. The other thing that is very influential on Bierstadt is Romanticism, right? And we talked about Romanticism before. Romanticism is this negative response to the Industrial Revolution. So you have huge factories going up all over Europe and in the east coast of America, and there are certain intellectuals that think that this is bad and wrong. And there always are people that think that progress is wrong and that we should sort of retreat into an earlier time. And so they saw nature as a source of renewal and a cure for this disenchantment with industrialism. So those are his 2 formative influences, Hudson River School and Romanticism, and his European training. 1859, Bierstadt joins the Lander expedition into Wyoming, one of these 18 expeditions that go out in the 1850s and 60s, near where Alfred Jacob Miller was. And his objective was to trace the wagon route for immigrants. This was kind of a dual purpose here. He did lots of field sketches. By 1860, he makes it out all the way to California. He takes another trip in 1863 to the Yosemite Valley and falls in love with Yosemite, stays out there for a while. And one of his major themes is the disappearing Indian, right? Quite often there's not a specific place, but it's an amalgam. So he'll take a mountain from here, some trees from over here, some Indians from there, and kind of squish them all together back in the studio. He did a lot of field sketches, but the finished product was always a studio production. Everything was used to sublime effect, and sublime is a word that gets thrown around a lot, so let me define it for you. Sublime refers to a place that is so powerful, it's terrifying. That you become overcome with emotion by contact with nature. This was seen as a good thing. This was considered one of the principal ways to enjoy nature. One of the other ones being the picturesque. Remember when I told you about the idea of being able to get through a painting? That's picturesque, right? You have an imaginative recreation of your time through through the landscape. That's the picturesque tradition. Another tradition is the sublime tradition. And even though you can get through this image, Bierstadt really wanted you to be overwhelmed. He really wanted you to be terrified by contact with nature. This is Niagara Falls. This is, you know, these are the great icons of the American East, in that case, and in this case, the American West, which is Mount Whitney, which is part of the Sierra Nevada range in the Sequoia National Park. Many of these paintings were sent on tour and viewed for a few minutes at a time for a charge. They would have a curtain over them, and they would be revealed for 5 cents, and you could sit there and wonder. I don't think this one was, but this is the type of painting, one of his great paintings that would have been. Specifically, this painting, painted between, we think, 1878 and 1880, traveled to the Paris Salon and was called one of the truly great American pictures in history by a leading critic at the time. And as you all know, from if you're docents here, you know that viewers always get a chance to see a little bit extra if you look closer. And so we can't see it in this reproduction, but there are fish in the foreground, there are deer in the background. So Bierstadt loved that ability to paint something that's 10 foot by 6 foot and still get you such close detail. And when you look at this painting, it's big enough, you really do almost feel like you're in the painting, right? And that was exactly what he was going for. So his vision of the West is very important. It's very operatic, though. It's very sort of over the top. It's very much a product of the 1860s. By the 1870s, that's going out of style. Smaller, more conservative paintings are coming in style, influenced by, in the 1880s, by Impressionism and other European movements. The last person in this sort of middle period is Thomas Moran, and he does sublime in large form. What we're looking at here is the Green River in Wyoming from 1907. He went out west first in the 1870s and gathered source material and painted it for the rest of his life. The Grand Canyon being among one of his favorites. And what we see here is a small party. It's hard to see if they're Native Americans or exactly what their origin is, but you can see how vast the landscape is and how small the people are. And he really wanted to get at this sense of wonder and awe. And he gets at the sublime in a slightly different way. He gets at it through these wonderful colors that he insisted all through his life were absolutely accurate, but when you look at some of his later works, especially the Grand Canyon works, such as the one we have upstairs, the colors get a little weird. They get a little hinky by my accounting, but he didn't think so. He thought they were absolutely truthful. In fact, in the 1870s, his trip to what is now Yellowstone, along with the photographer W.H. Jackson, Jackson's photos and Moran's paintings combined to make Congress vote Yellowstone as the first national park, which is quite a big deal. And if any of you have been to Yellowstone, it is absolutely overwhelming. So there was this idea even then of trying to preserve nature, even though they were driving Indians off the land. Once they got there, they realized, wow, this is beautiful. This is a cathedral. We need to save this in some sense. Even though Indians by the 1870s and 80s were mostly on reservations, Moran, throughout his life, he doesn't die till 1929, throughout his life he has them free. He has them in wide open settings like this. Here he uses very little realism, though, unfortunately. There's a lot of artistic license. This is kind of what this scene looks like, but he changes it a lot. He moves things around, and he uses a fantasy world with light and color, and the mountainsides which look like castle walls. And later in his life, he would revisit the Grand Canyon, Green River, and others over and over again. Cowboy artists. So we're looking here at a photo of Charles M. Russell. Some biographies say that Russell had both Midwestern American ancestry, but also some Indian. And if you look at his face, I think you can kind of see that in the background. He grew up in St. Louis, was familiar with Charles Weimar, George Catlin, and others, some of these early artists. He was basically untrained, and he was a really raw talent when he started. He leaves for Montana when he's 15 years old. He had this abiding passion for the West, and he thought St. Louis wasn't far enough west. He had to get out to the cowboys and Indians. Always had a love for it. He grew up on dime novels and earlier artistic representations. The bison skull becomes his signature as early as 1887. It signifies a time in the past, the buffalo are passing. He paints whatever he can in Montana, trains only from art manuals that his parents sent him. He had no artistic training. He was He was completely self-taught. He creates an image of himself as a simple artist, a simple Western artist, as a cowboy artist, versus other well-to-do artists from the East Coast, like, I don't know, Remington, who went to Yale and had a New York City studio. It reminds me of that commercial from years ago, New York City, you know, like, so there was a definite positioning of, hey, I'm just a simple cowpoke from the West. I'm not an Eastern elite, right? So there's already this sense in the West of trying to distance from the East. Of course, all the money, people, and ideas come from the East and go West, but once people get out West, they try to sever those ties a little bit and say, no, I'm really Western. We have nothing to do with the East. He was a painter first and then an illustrator, which is an unusual career path. Most of these artists started as illustrators and then became painters. He was a painter who became an illustrator. And he is the only artist I can think of in the history of Western art, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, who started out as, no joke, as a terrible artist, and through 40 years became a phenomenal artist, right? So because he's completely self-taught, he has no professor sitting over his back saying, you know, change this line or make this color different. He just does it all from intuition. And he becomes, there's a trajectory in his career over 40 years which is unmistakably better. I mean, almost straight up. I mean, by the end of his career, he's a brilliant painter, but he was not at first. If I showed you some of his very first drawings and paintings, you'd be amazed. He did over 4,000 works of art total in his life, and his compositions grew in complexity and get much, much better throughout his life. Here we have Indian Scouting Wagon Train, 1902. It's a watercolor. He becomes a real master of watercolor. And here you see his love for the West that was. By 1902, almost all Indians were on reservations. Their numbers had dwindled to about 1 million. Today we have about 5.3 million Native Americans. They dwindled to 1 million from an estimated high of anywhere from 10 to 30 million before contact. He really has a preference for that which has passed. Although he always shows a great subtlety and nuance in his Indians as far as a tenderness. He has a soft spot for Native Americans in his body of work. But that doesn't mean he wasn't perpetuating a stereotype by only representing that which was in the past. This is the beginning of his best period. He has strong composition, a lighter palette. He's very bold and experimental. He liked his Indians as they were rather than as they are. And it can border into sentimental myth-making, especially the later in his career it gets, the further past those prime times were. This is When the Plains Were His, 1906, oil and canvas, one of his all-time classics. And this is just an absolutely classic Russell composition. You see the figures in the center. You see all the lines of composition that are coming in from diagonals, from the bottom left, bottom right, top left, top right, centering there. You see the background. It's not a specific place or a specific time. You might be familiar with this. Russell made this for the Calgary Stampede of 1910. Well, actually, of 1912. He painted in 1910 and made it to the Calgary Stampede of 1912. And it recently came back in 2012 from the Calgary Stampede 100-year anniversary, where they had an exhibition of all of his paintings that were brought together 100 years later at one of the museums in Calgary. And it was a beautiful thing to be able to be a part of. But I think you can see here that this is, again, part of his best period. He's a little more subtle with his colors and his light at his height here. This shows action and nostalgia, and these were the biggest sellers. His wife, Nancy, was always pushing him to paint paintings like this. He would have preferred to paint small watercolors his whole life, but his wife saw that these got the big bucks and really pushed him to paint these. And you can see why this is enjoyable, right? It's a mix-up. So you can see that the cowboy has got the rope around the tail of the other cowboy's horse, and in just a minute there'll be what they call a predicament. There'll be a problem here, right? And we get it right at the moment where there's a lot of action, a lot of drama, a lot of great compositional technique coming in, again with the lines centering from the external. But we don't get to see that, but we get to enjoy the sort of tee-hee of what will come and what will happen. Remington, born in upstate New York, goes to Yale for a year, is more interested in football than in illustrating, and he is the other great big name of this time period. He achieves great motion in both his paintings and sculptures. He works first as an illustrator at Harper's shortly after 1881 when he first went to the West. And he creates thousands of illustrations, or I'm sorry, hundreds of illustrations. For Remington, the land is always the background. The focus is always the people and the horses. Those are his claim to authenticity, right? When he paints U.S. cavalrymen, he paints them absolutely dead on with the correct rank and the correct everything, right? Because that's how he claims his authenticity, because he is an East Coast artist. He does have a studio in New York, and to kind of counter those things, he A, takes extensive trips west, and B, he gets all those details. He nails them down very, very correctly. But sometimes the details seduce viewers into believing his images. A lot of his images were finished in his New York studio, and the images quite often were from his own imagination or were to illustrate stories. So they're not the real West necessarily, but they are accurate in that sense. He wrote a lot of stories too, made over 3,000 works of art in his life. His Indians, however, create a certain type that stood for all people and all tribes. There was no subtlety as to ethnographic detail. There was no subtlety as to what tribe someone belonged to. Remington was also kind of an unpleasant man with a lot of very racist views, and he wasn't afraid of saying them. So that's why I think he tends to get the kind of the not as favorable review in history, because Russell was a really nice guy. The old who would you rather have a beer with? Probably Charlie Russell. You know, Remington was not all that enjoyable as a person. But one of the things he does, well, let me go back and talk just for a second about this. This is important because this is conjuring the black buffalo. This is the advent of the ghost dance. So in the 1880s, the ghost dance originated among the Northern Plains Indians when all the buffalo had and they were decimated. They created a dance that would conjure the buffalo back and make the white people go away, make the buffalo come back and have their old way of life come back. And so Remington gets this. There were about 20 million buffalo in 1850. They were nearly extinct by this point. So he gets the subtlety of this. And yet, in his own view, the passing of the tribes was inevitable and manifest destiny was right. And so this is an ode to the past. This is not, he doesn't agree with the ghost dance. He's giving you an image of something in the past. One of the things we remember him most for, though, is his absolute accomplishment in illustrating movement. No artist before him, American artist before him, had illustrated movement quite like he does. His bronzes, which he took up in 1895 almost as a challenge, as something to do, something to keep him occupied, he was trying to compete with John Bologna and Michelangelo. He was looking back to the Renaissance and the Baroque tradition in Europe. He was trying to be that good, and he really was, and he had no training as a sculptor. He took it up. So there's a drama to his formula. There's a formal challenge. The bronze presents prestige. It presents a European prototype. They're really revolutionary. They're flights in metal. They're all about motion and movement. As you see here, all the weight is over the back two legs. And if you look at this in our gallery, it's really all about movement, right? That's what he's really interested in. And I had taken it out of the vitrine so you could see also the way that the light dances off the patina and how the chasing of the metal was so important to him. Early on, sculpture was very difficult in the American West because the materials were expensive, they were heavy. You really needed a European tradition to carry it out. No one really had that tradition. But slowly, people like Remington and others start to invent their own tradition. And as the American West moves on and becomes more civilized, there is more money and there are more stable homes where you can bring bronzes in. I thought I'd show you the last drop as well. This was originally a painting by Shri Vogel, about 1900, and it paints an iconic image of the West, which was a very popular image for Shri Vogel. It became a color lithograph, and it was very popular. In fact, it was recreated by Buffalo Bill on one of his flyers, as the painting was. Later became a bronze, and then for a long time it was this image was on the inside of Stetson hats. So it was a very long-lived image. It was inspired by Shri Vogel's time out west, and it's not typical in that it's not violent. Most of his scenes are very violent. It shows a sentimental bond between either a cowboy or a cavalryman and his horse. And there's one last image in cowboy, and this is a transition. This is William H. Buck Dutton, Bronco Buster, which is up on the third floor. And why I put this in here was because Dutton is a transitional figure. Dutton goes on to Taos. And I won't say much about this other than say he was the only Taos artist that was absolutely enamored and fascinated with the outdoors, with camping, hunting, and with the cowboy. He was the only cowboy artist of them. So the West is vacation land, Taos, Santa Fe, and beyond. This is Taos Pueblo here. By the 1890s, the Indian Wars had ended. 1892, the frontier was officially closed by a historian who said, you know, it's closed. We don't have enough. We have too much density in the West. It can no longer be considered a frontier. The railroad's in full swing, bringing people from east to west. This wealthy nation of America looks towards the West as not just a place to extract goods anymore, not just a place to fight Indians, and not just a place to reinvent themselves, but also as a place for vacation now. By the 1880s, if you can believe it, there was vacationing happening in Taos and Santa Fe. So lots of American artists were disenchanted by the Eastern establishment. This is, again, this idea, this sort of romantic ideal that cities and industry are bad, and what's good for the soul is nature and forests and streams and things that aren't industrialized. So a lot of these artists that go to Taos and to Santa Fe have European training, but they need to find American subjects. And what better place to find American subjects than in Taos, because you have a population of sedentary Indians who have been agriculturalists for 500 years and who have battled with the United States for so long, and with Spain before that and Mexico before that for so long, that they're done fighting and that they just want to be left alone, and they're willing to work for peanuts. So it's a good place to go, right? It's beautiful, warm climate. You have French, French trapper culture there. You have Spanish colonial culture there. You have early American culture there. It's a beautiful place. It's still just a territory until 1912. So when the early artists were going there around the turn of the century, they could say it was really the Wild Wild West. Early on, the artists would pose Indians with pottery and a link to the ethnographic photographers from 20 years earlier. And this is a really interesting period in America because the Native American goes from a warrior to a ward of the state. And it's really interesting what happens in the American psyche. Once we're no longer fighting the Indians, once the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 80s are over, it's almost as if we as a nation can stand back and say, oh no, now we're losing them all. Like I said, population 20 million in 1500, 1 million in 1900. So there's a sense that we're going to lose Native American culture and Native Americans forever. And so they go from a warrior to a ward of the state, and that creates a nostalgia. It creates a desire to know about what Indians were. The Native Americans in this area had periodic and predictable dances and ceremonies like the corn dance. There was a great symbolism in their blankets and pots that really resonated with the modernists, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Like I said, there was a Hispanic culture from the 16th century. There are beautiful mountains, the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the Santa Fe Railroad helped too. By the 1880s, Santa Fe Railroad was coming to Santa Fe, and then there was a stagecoach you could take to Taos. This is Ainger Irving Kaus, and he was one of the very first to go to Taos. He mixed and matched his ethnography quite a bit. He used photography extensively. His granddaughter found over 7,000 photographs in his house in Taos. The Kaus house in Taos. Kaus house, that's right, okay. He was the most commercially successful of the Taos Society of Artists, which was a commercial collective that was formed for about 15 years to help these artists way out west travel their paintings back east and through the Midwest. And it was a way for selling paintings. And that was the basic use. The Santa Fe Railroad also was a big patron, bought hundreds of paintings, created calendars from them, and that was thousands of those went out east and tracked people west. By this time, in 1915, we're full on into tourism, right? There's really not a lot of extractive business going on anymore for most people that come to Santa Fe and to Taos. They're there to see Indians. They're there to enjoy the West. So here we see a pretty stereotypical image of a good Indian, a noble Indian, Indian making art, and Indian as cultural commodity. So He had favorite models that he frequently outfitted with the same exact outfits. Sometimes they were Plains Indian outfits with headdresses and war bonnets and such like that. So ethnography was not his thing. What was important to him was this romantic ideal, this idea that Indians were a source of renewal for the beleaguered American soul. Walter Ufer, one of my absolutely favorite artists, this is Land of Manana, and he is a social activist. He's also German, born in Germany, moved to America, and he was a radical socialist, and a lot of his paintings actually comment on social injustice that he saw towards Indians. And he was profoundly moved in 1918, just a year after this. The Spanish influenza of 1918 decimated New Mexico because there was a huge native population. And Native Americans to this day quite often don't have the same resistance disease that white Americans do for a whole variety of reasons. That's a separate lecture. And so he was a very compassionate man. He took many Taos Pueblo Indians into his home and cared for them during the influenza. And he had very radical politics for the day, very socialist radical politics. And so here, this is part of my dissertation. I'm not going to go too long into it. But basically what I read this is that Jim Mirabal, one of his good friends who's a Taos Indian, is looking back out at us, and he's not happy with us, is he? Right? So he's sort of saying, what are you looking at, right? And this is his everyday reality, and yet it's titled The Land of Manana, the land of tomorrow, right? Not yesterday. Looking forward. Walter Ufer and this Indian are looking forward. They're looking into the future. They're saying we're not in the past. This is happening right now. Oscar Burninghouse. Here we have Indians from 1920, Rockwell piece. He did a lot of Indian rabbit hunts and other hunts, and this was a way for him to really focus in on things that were Indian, Indians doing Indian type things, and these sold very well back east, right? So he wasn't as interested in making them contemporary people. He's more interested in showing historic things that they did historically. Here Dunton shows up again. This is Deer Hunter's Camp from our own collection. Dunton was a great outdoorsman, and how I read this is that is Dunton on the right and a companion on the left, and they're camping in the great outdoors. And so these images of simple, rustic Taos and Santa Fe sold incredibly well to Eastern patrons because they were beleaguered, and they really felt that there had to be a cure for the malaise that it is that we all go through every day here, right, in the industrialized East Coast. That there was a way to get west and to lose yourself and to get back to a more primitive state, literally in some cases, because there was a great affection for Native Americans, but it was sort of patronizing, and that was sort of like white Americans could kind of take over their culture, play Indian, those type of things. Every artist I've shown you till now in Taos Society of Artists were trained academically, which means they went to the studios of Paris and Munich and other places in Europe, and they learned how to draw the human form, and they learned the Renaissance tradition. Other artists came, the abstractionists and the modernists came. And so here we see John Moran, Taos Mountain Chain #2 from our own collection, recent purchase. And Moran was more interested in how the land could be broken up into shapes, into facets, right? He's interested in Cubism. He's interested in other modernist movements that look at a painting as paint. They look at what it is that the forms of nature, how they can inform art and to make it beautiful. They're not so interested in saying this is a specific place in Taos. It's more, what are those shapes? How can I reconfigure them to make them into beautiful form? George O'Keeffe. This is 1956. O'Keeffe really believed that she was inspired by Native Americans, inspired by their land, inspired by them as people, inspired by their art. And so she took abstraction in that direction. She believed in a mysticism that was inherent in the objects in the land. And then the result was sort of a mystical abstraction that was based on the magic of the object, the magic of the West. I'm going a little faster now because I'm running late. The illustrators and their legacy. The painting that you see right here is actually very, very interesting. It's by Norman Rockwell, and it's in a museum on the West Coast, and it's a very large painting. And this painting actually became a scene in one of the John Wayne movies. And don't ask me right now, I can't remember it, but exactly where it came from, but it was one of his classics. And that's one of the things I'll talk about with the illustrators real quickly, is that there became a nexus between Hollywood and the illustrators, and they actually started to influence one another, kind of in a cross-cultural. So a Hollywood producer would see something like this and say, hey, let's make a scene of this in our movie, and then the movie would come out, and other images from the movie would influence the illustrators. One of the most famous illustrators that we will know from our own collection is N.C. Wyeth right here. But first let me talk a little bit about what's going on at this point. As I said earlier, last Indian battle was 1890. The frontier officially closed in 1892. At the turn of the 20th century, though, as the Wild West fades, American desire for myth increases. So as the West fades as a reality, as the Wild West fades as a reality, our desire to know it and to know the myth of the West only increases. And that's why you actually have a greater production of Western things in the 20th century than in the 19th century. In the 19th century, basically had a purpose. It was either to see if there was a way for a railroad to get through, see if there was a way to pacify or defeat Indians, see if there were resources, and just to see what the West looked like. By the 20th century, all those things have been accomplished, and yet our desire for Western images only increases. The camera can't easily capture nostalgia. The camera has made tremendous strides. In just 20 years, Ansel Adams will be doing his thing, 20 or 30 years. The camera has come light years, and yet the camera can't capture nostalgia nearly as well as the painted image can. Novelists and illustrators intensify the imaginings of what the West was. They idealize it. The tradition of Western illustrators follows after Buffalo Bill and dime novels, and eventually Hollywood myth-making. Illustrators of the West look to Remington and Russell as models, but they try to surpass the masters. The introduction of the halftone, which is a process I don't have time to explain, but I can explain later. The introduction of the halftone led to many, many, many more illustrated magazines. It wasn't until about 1890 that the halftone as a way of reproducing in magazines became prominent, and that just exploded the amount and type of illustration that can be made in magazines, because the old woodblock illustrations were kind of primitive in comparison. Halftones actually looked almost like photography, and so they were really good for getting at the West. Saturday Evening Post being among the most exceptional. So the stories and pictures were part of a nostalgia for a disappearing West, and the new illustrators were not self-taught like Russell and Remington. They were mostly taught in one of two ways. On the East Coast, they were mostly taught by Howard Pyle at the Brandywine School in Pennsylvania. And Pyle taught Wyeth, Harvey Dunn, W.H.D. Corner, Frank Schoonover, and others. And Pyle's main philosophy was that he taught his students to illustrate stories imaginatively. He wasn't so interested in if you could draw the human form. He didn't want you to sit there and draw plaster casts for hours and hours and hours. He wanted to see if you could use your imagination. So it wasn't critical anymore that these artists go to the West to collect their information. It was important that they could explore their mind. So this is really a pivotal change, right? So authenticity is no longer the calling card of the Western artist. Some artists still, we can get into, once we get into the later 20th century, a lot of artists do go to the West or are from the West and are very authentic. But right at this moment, at this critical juncture, authenticity is not the calling card. Imagination is. So that was his method of teaching. He urged his students to immerse themselves in the subject, to learn as much as they could about it, and to think about it. He wasn't interested in the human body as much as he was narrative. What could an image tell you? Because most of these, remember, went to illustrate stories that were in Saturday Evening Post and others. So they had to tell a story, right? So N.C. Wyeth, I shall never forget the sight. It was like a great green sea, 1918 from our own collection. And there's a lot of interpretation you could make of this painting. But basically what I wanted to get at was that the title is actually a line it's a caption that was used when it was illustrating a novel, the novel Vandermark's Folly. So these were illustrated either for Saturday Evening Post or for books. He studied with Howard Pyle, did N.C. Wyeth. He did actually travel west in 1904, although it was not necessary. But he produced more than 400 illustrations based on his Western adventures, and he only went out once and for a very brief time. So it shows you that imagination is the key. Our own Norman Rockwell's The Buffalo Hunt, 1915. If you look at the dates of his birth, 1894, he's not but 20 or 21 when he makes this painting. So he was not a Pyle student. He was an independent, but he was trained as an artist. He had a very early and long-lived success, and he illustrates a lot of young adult novels, which is in fact what this painting was for. It illustrates, oh, I don't have it down here, the book up there, by the Red Arrow by Elmer Russell Gregor, 1915. If you look in the galleries, these two pieces are next to one another now. He had never been west. And as far as, about 21 when he made this, he'd never been west. I don't know for sure if he ever made it west. So it shows you like the emphasis and imagination. The second school was the West Coast. Most of the West Coast artists were not taught at one single school, but at various schools. Most were based in LA, although they traveled throughout the West. Ed Boreen, Frank Tenney Johnson, and Maynard Dixon are some of the major figures that come out of the West Coast illustrators movement. And eventually, it was these illustrators that fed into Western movies and vice versa. This was that nexus I was talking about. Frank Tenney Johnson here, The Morning Shower, 1927, in the Rockwell collection. Johnson illustrated many novels. He sold a lot of night scenes. Unfortunately, we do not have any night scenes in our collection, but that's what he became famous for. And by 1920, he moved from the East Coast to California and became a fine artist. This is 27. This is 7 years after he moved to the West Coast, and he was a very popular artist, both as a fine artist and as an illustrator. Maynard and Dixon, here we have Desert Valley, which could have been inspired by Death Valley, which he visited in 1921. He was very taken by bold compositions, loose, impressionistic brushwork. He liked rugged Western landscapes as a place for truth for artists. And he started out as an illustrator, actually wrote to Remington later in Remington's career, sent him some images and said, you know, what am I doing right, what am I doing wrong? And Remington inspired him, as well as Ed Boreen, to go on and be fine artists, not just illustrators. So Dixon starts in California, moves to New York as an illustrator, becomes disillusioned, moves back west, and he simplifies everything. He makes composition simple, he makes everything about shapes and colors and not about narrative, right? So this is one movement. So he's an artist that started as an illustrator, really becomes a fine artist in sort of a different vein than some of the other illustrators. I know we're doing all right on time, aren't we? Yeah? How are we doing on time?
How much more time?
I got 1 page left. All right. I got the green light. Is that all right?
Yeah.
All right. So we're on to the second generation. So as the second generation of illustrator artists come to maturity, they are a generation removed from the Howard Pyle generation. So there is a strive for authenticity and imagination. So they take the lessons of Howard Pyle, which is use your imagination to create these great things, but they add to that a flavor of authenticity, right? Many of these artists are either from the West or move and live permanently in the West. Many or most are members of the Cowboys Artists Association, the National Association of Western Artists, and others. They start a close association between contemporary Western art and the Western Art Museum. And this is very important to understand, that in the 1950s and 60s, there were millionaires and billionaires that had made their fortunes through timber, oil, extracting minerals from the ground in the West, and all these other sources of extractive capitalism. They'd made all this money. They were living in places like Dallas, Texas, like Cody, Wyoming, like Los Angeles. They wanted an art that represented their region of the country. They found people that were willing to do it, but they didn't find any museums that were very much interested in their art. They didn't find art historians that were willing to talk about their art, and they didn't find museums that would hang their art. What do you do when you're a billionaire and no one will listen to you? You build your own. You buy your own art. Amon Carter, Fort Worth, Texas. No one cared about Russell and Remington. He bought hundreds of Remington and Russells, and then he bought also some of these contemporary artists, built his own museum. There are examples galore of this. The Stark Museum in Orange, Texas. This is really the Western art consortium that starts that we're now part of. And it all starts from an unwillingness of the East Coast snobs to talk to the West Coast artists that are collecting cowboy art. And they say, fine, we'll get our own art historians, we'll get our own museums, we'll buy our own art, and na-na to boo-boo is essentially what they say, right? It's coming back around now. In the second generation, you have people like Charlie Dye, that he has there's a pressure to try to preserve Western art and life, or is it simply nostalgia? Are we back to nostalgia? And there is something sort of ironic about their adherence to the past, right? So you're now in the 1950s and 60s. What's happening in the big wide world of art in the 50s and 60s? Abstract expressionism, Andy Warhol, right? All that's happening. And yet you have an image like Come and Get It, 1961, right? We're just, a few years out of Vietnam. There's all sorts of, the hippies are coming. There's all sorts of things coming, right? And yet he's painting Come and Get It in 1961. So there's something almost, dare I say, counterculture about being so conservative in a time that was not conservative necessarily. So actually, Charlie Dye was a student of Harvey Dunn, who was a Pyle student, so he has a direct connection. Next image is Tom Lovell, who was born in New York City, started illustrating young, and then moved west, 40 years in the West. He became one of the finest cowboy artists ever. He was co-founder of the National Association of Western Artists and of the Cowboy Artists of America. And he specialized in genre scenes and had a great nostalgia for the Old West. Clyde Aspivig from our own collection, you can see there is this absolute need for fidelity to nature, right? And that becomes really key in this second generation of Western artists. Aspivig retired in '71 to become a professional artist. He grew up working on ranches close to the mountains and wildlife. He's based in Wyoming, and almost all of his paintings are in Wyoming. And I just want to take 5 minutes to talk about innovation and tradition, the art of the next West. Right here we have a fabulous sculpture by a really prominent Chicano artist that is in front of the Denver airport. And for some reason I'm forgetting his name. It'll come to me momentarily, I'm sure. So this is an example of what the new West is, right? You have a really innovative sculptural building in the background, and you have this really innovative Chicano art in the front. One of the most exciting people right now that I know working, or a pair I should say, is Mark Klett and Byron Wolfe. And this is Point Imperial, the Grand Canyon, 50% Ansel Adams, 50% the Red Wall limestone. This is a digital ink jet print, and what this artist does is he takes historic photos and lithographs, scans them in at very high quality, takes his own photographs and then blends them seamlessly. And what it does is it really speaks about the compression of time, right? I won't go into too much detail. This is Rob Kendrick. This is Cowboys from his 7-year journey into cowboy land America. And he took as his inspiration the ethnographic photos at the turn of the century of Native Americans. And so tongue firmly in cheek, he said, I'm going to go out and explore the native cowboy of this land before he disappears forever. There's irony in that, but there's some truth in it, but there's also some documentation. So he goes through and takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos of working photographers, but he does it in tintype. Does anyone here know what a tintype photograph is? It's a very early photograph, just after the daguerreotype, not long after the daguerreotype, and it is actually on tin. The image is etched into tin, and these images, by their very nature, by the medium, look old-timey, right? So there's something interesting there too about time and about the inability of nostalgia to really gain you back that time, sort of the folly of nostalgia, but also how a medium like a tintype, a simple choice, can sort of get you there in a strange way. And finally, I have to give some props to my own purchases. Here is Jason Saitaki, CDOSA from your Chevrolet 1910. And what I really like about Jason's work is that he combines an absolute academic understanding of how to paint. He can draw a human body. He can draw anything he likes. He can draw like an angel. And then he does something conceptual like this, whereas he takes an old Chevy, which is actually a toy, and he has it looking out at this picturesque, sublime, kind of both, right, the landscape. And then the mountains, the Rocky Mountains in the background, are cardboard, right? Construction. Our Western reality is somewhat constructed, isn't it? just a little bit. There's always been that tension in Western American art between what's real and what's constructed and what you see and what you get out of it as a viewer. I think Jason's work gets to that perfectly. Thank you so much for letting me go a little bit longer. Thanks.